The challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. In the 2010 Citizens United case, the Supreme Court ruled that corporations are people. But some legal scholars point out that the legal consequences for misbehavior by corporate people are typically far less certain or severe than for such misbehavior by flesh and blood people. An increasing number of Americans are confronting such preferential treatment. What they are doing, what you can do, that's our challenge today. When Money Speaks with Faith. So we'd like to begin by thanking and welcoming our guests. We have Bruce Herbert from Newground Social Investment, the chief executive, the founder, and the investment advisor there. Dr. Marc Cohan, professor in the departments of management and philosophy at Seattle University. And Sister Judy Byron from the Adrian Dominican Sisters and the director of the Northwest Coalition for Responsible Investments. Thank you each very, very much for joining us today. This is an important topic, and we're getting a lot of interest focused on the issues that we're going to talk about today. Perhaps one of the most famous quotes relating to business and the national interest was one done years ago, and that's what's good for General Motors is good for America. Now that was a more nuanced statement that actually came out at that time. But I would like to ask each of you, does that general view prevail today among businesses? And if so, is that responsible for much of the corporate disconnect from the impact of their policies on everyday citizens? What's your feeling on that?
Well, Jeff, I've been doing this work for 20 years now, and as I reflected on that, what's good for General Motors is good for America, and I think it's beginning to turn around, that what's good for America is good for General Motors. And I think we saw that, we see that in working with companies, when the CEO of Walmart tells us, that they have to pay attention to how they're contributing to the social fabric of the communities where they are. And then also in our gun safety work, which we probably will talk about later, BlackRock, wrote to the gun manufacturers and said that the success of their companies, the long-term success, will be how they pay attention to the societal impact of their business. So I think more and more we're seeing it, from investors and then also from the companies, and also customers of companies are making that happen.
Sense of optimism. We're going to delve into those issues much more. Marc and Bruce, what's your take on that?
You go first.
Yeah, happily. Well, I think there's been a historic transition, and in years past, decades past, companies did have a lot of authority and control, but there was a natural curb or constraint from the top, from the CEOs who had an imbued sense of duty to their society and communities. But as companies have grown and as companies have moved so much in the workplace and as well as management moves, and here we have Boeing who picked up from its historic hometown and moved to Chicago, there is less a felt sense of dedication and duty. But as Sister Judy aptly said, there actually is now such a coincidence, an alignment of interest, both profitability as well as interest in the environment, treating workers well, treating communities well, and having a sense of the larger societal purpose, that these things now are starting to come into line where it's not the company at the head, it's really the whole, as it should be.
Marc?
Maybe I'm more worried.
I'm not unworried, but
maybe that I'm more worried. I think a company like General Motors is a global corporation now. And the idea that General Motors' fate is tied up with the fate of the United States, I think is no longer true.
That's true.
So I think General Motors becomes this entity that is its own thing. And what's best for General Motors may not be what's best for the United States. It may be what's best for the Chinese is also maybe better for General Motors. So I think it becomes a much more complicated question once you have a sense of global corporations.
Right.
I'd like to piggyback on that in the sense that at one time, perhaps more during the time earlier that I mentioned, companies and governments played, if you will, in the same sandbox. They played in the same geographic boundaries. But as corporations have expanded their reach and are global now, governments still are not. So there is much more concern about governance and control over corporate activity.
Let's take one example of that. Judy, you decided not to wait for companies to reform from the inside out,
Right.
but to attempt to move along reform from the outside in. And one of your actions involved a highly charged issue of firearms.
Right.
Take us through that a little bit, if you would.
Well, Bruce and I are both members of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, which has been in existence for 50 years doing corporate responsibility. And so there are over 300 faith-based members and investment groups, et cetera. And so a couple of years ago, we were looking at the gun issue, and we had addressed it in previous years, and we also have worked on, human rights, the human right to health and safety and life, et cetera. And we've worked with companies on military weapons like Boeing and being ethical in selling those.
So in one of these cases, Sister Judy, you had a pretty good response.
Right, we did.
But in another instance, or one of the actors, if you will, you did not have the same response.
Right, from the
Tell
gun
us about
manufacturers. Well, we didn't hear from them, but we still didn't go public about what we were doing because, we still we really wanted to be in dialogue with them. That's what we wanted to do. Well, we know what happened on February 14th. We had the tragedy in Parkland. And the kids really, the very first day stood up and said, this is enough, and what they were going to do, et cetera. And so it became known then that we had filed these shareholder resolutions. And big investors, BlackRock, wrote to the companies, et cetera, and it became a very public issue. So they still didn't, they talked to no shareholders, the gun manufacturers, they say. So they went, the Sturm Ruger went to a vote at the Sturm Ruger annual meeting in the spring, and it got, 69% of the vote, which was
Really?
majority, but, and the CEO was not very happy. He said that they would write the report, but they would not change their business. So they're supposed to be writing a report for us by February. And American Outdoor Brands that also went to a vote, and we got a majority vote there also. But Dick's is really the success story. Right away after Parkland, on the 28th of February, the CEO announced that they would no longer sell assault weapons, that they would raise the age to 21, they would destroy the assault weapons, they wouldn't even return them to the companies, and they would hire lobbyists to work on sensible gun reform in Washington, D.C. Now, how many companies do we know that hire lobbyists to, work on things like that?
Well, I might ask both you and Bruce, and then Marc will come to you, is for you to put that in a larger perspective of what your group has done and is doing right now. And Bruce, I'd include you on that since you were really on the ground floor here. Describe the mission of your coalition overall, if you will. And then you've mentioned Sturm Ruger and Dick's, but give us a sense of what have been some of the other successes that you've had. Bruce, do you want to begin with that?
Sure. Well, of course, Newground's mission is to harness the power of business for good and to help people to have their values reflected in their investments. And so what we look at are a whole range of different issues. It's like the ones that Sister Judy has talked about, but environmental issues, peace and justice issues, equity and hiring. They fall into the rubric of environment, social, and governance. ES and G are acronyms that you'll hear a lot. And and we make active use of the shareholder proposal process that is constructed through the Securities and Exchange Commission to make our voices known. And I like to say I began my career on Wall Street with Merrill Lynch, and I like to say that however I might feel about an issue in my heart, I speak to it in terms that a board of directors can legally take action on. And so that means that I put it in terms of benefits to the company, profitability, reputational benefit or avoidance of reputational harm, things like that. And we find more and more people getting quite interested and quite on board. In fact, the growth of the movement, the social investment movement, has been really quite staggering. Every 2 years a study is done. It's called the Trends Report. And so in 2014, it had grown 76%, or the money invested in this fashion. And from 14 to 16, another 33% compounding on top of that. And just released in November of 18, another 38% on top of that. It is trillions and trillions of dollars now. 1 in every $4 that's invested professionally is invested with some form of E, S, or G screening or consideration. And so talking about it becoming mainstream, it really is, and talking about the integration of values of people, community, and companies is really at the opening gate of that in a really significant way. Not that it's all going to happen flawlessly, not that we don't have serious problems, because we most certainly do, but there's also cause for hope.
Do you take essentially sort of a nuanced approach that you tailor to the given situation? I get the sense from what you were saying, Sister Judy, that you don't immediately file a shareholder resolution. Right. It seems that there's a period of dialogue and then it moves from that. Take us through that process, if you would.
Well, with all the companies, I mean, I could, you talked about other issues, whether we were working on access to health issues or whether we were working on human trafficking, modern day slavery issues. We always, write to the company first to say what we're concerned about and ask to work with them. And then if there's no response or if the conversation is unsatisfactory and there's something that we think we need to bring before all the shareholders, which happens if you file a shareholder resolution and it's on the proxy, then we do file a shareholder resolution. And since we work collaboratively, like with the gun manufacturers, there were 12 co-filers on that resolution. It wasn't just, one of the communities of sisters.
Interesting.
Yeah. And sometimes, I mean, we had an Exxon resolution a few years ago on the 2-degree Celsius scenario with Exxon. I think we had over 40 co-filers. I mean, so it's a real collaborative effort, and they need to pay attention.
As you do this, do you constantly reassess your strategy, the practices you're doing, and find that you need to adapt them for different industries or just even different personalities?
Right. Yes. And when you were saying, what's the mission of your group with the Northwest Coalition for Responsible Investment, which is a program of our center, the mission of our center is systemic change. So when we started the Northwest CRY, we call it, the idea was to bring systemic change to corporate boardrooms in environmental, social, and governance issues. And the members of the Northwest CRY are religious communities of women and one men's group, and also a couple of our healthcare systems, and it's their investments that we're using. And we always say that we want financial returns on our money, and like Bruce said, he doesn't go with it. I think probably sometimes I go more with my heart and I let them worry about the financial returns, but we also want social and environmental returns on our money. And we want to make impact with it.
Marc, as you listen to this, from your perspective, what's your reaction to that?
I think it's impressive. I would want to know more about the successes, and I'd also want to know more about the difference between the cases where it succeeds and where it doesn't. But I worry about it. As much as I teach in a business school, I worked in business, I worry a lot about making arguments that appeal to profit. There was an article about all the scandal around Google and Google, the operating system that Google's building for the Chinese government. And the chairman of Alphabet was quoted as saying, in order to operate in China, we have to compromise our core values. And the weird thing is, it was reported in CNBC, like on the website, and it stopped there. Because that sentence could have had two different conclusions. One conclusion could have been, so of course we're not going, because we won't compromise our core values.
Right.
But it didn't say it. Or I think it was the unstated assumption was, so we're compromising. And I think there's an instance where it's clear that there's an enormous amount of money to be made. It requires compromising, and he sort of presents himself as the person on the board willing to make the tough call. He's willing to be tough and realistic, give up the core values to make money. We spent a lot of time talking about this in one of my classes last week, and it's a strange thing. So I worry a lot about the appeal to financial outcomes in this space, because there's a lot of money to be made in business practices that I think none of us want to see.
We're going to talk more about that. One question that I would have is that you were talking about human trafficking. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, and I suspect a lot of our viewers would be, how are you approaching that issue then?
Well, human trafficking really is a euphemism for modern day slavery. Mm-hmm. And the fact is, that we have 44 million people in our world who are slaves. And, I sometimes say our global economy is built on them, really. So we've worked on this issue now for, I don't know how many years, Bruce, probably since the early 2000s with companies. And we started with the travel and tourism industry and the whole sexual exploitation of children and also, others. And I could give you the example of Hyatt hotels. In 2010, we wrote to them to ask what they were doing to train their employees to recognize when someone coming into the hotel might be being pimped or prostituted or trafficked by the person they're with. And so we got involved in a very productive dialogue with Hyatt hotels, and they began training their employees, and they focused not only on the sex trafficking, but they began to look at the labor trafficking and who was doing their laundry and where were the employees coming who were there in their kitchens, etc. And in 2015, which was 5 years later, they signed the ECPAT Code to Protect Children, which says all the things they were doing, training, etc. And when I wrote to the corporate secretary she was the global corporate secretary, to thank her, she said, when you came to me, I was new on the job and I had no idea what the issue was. Mm-hmm. And in those 5 years, they had moved to where they train everyone now, from the person at the desk to the bellhop to the driver of the van to the housekeepers, to recognize when something isn't right and then what to do about it. And it's become, a brand standard for Hyatt now that they do that. So we've really, and we're working now. I mean, agriculture is an area where, it's an issue because many of the workers are undocumented workers. So, when they're abused, not paid just wages, et cetera, how can they complain if they're undocumented? So,
when you have a success story like that, do you go ahead and put out some press in terms of recognizing those? Because it would seem, and I'd be curious about your take on that too, Marc and Bruce, part of the initiative, it would seem, is lifting up their general reputation within the marketplace, within the country or the state. What sort of feedback do you give that basically supports those sorts of changes? And we do that. We always try to work with the company, though, so that we put out a press release that is agreeable to both of us. And it's interesting, sometimes they don't want to, and it's because they say, well, if we say we're doing this, and then all of a sudden, if it should be found that in one of our hotels this is happening, it's an issue. So it wasn't the case with Hyatt, but we've had other companies that they don't want to say what they're doing because they might be found to be lacking in some instance and would be liable then for what they had said.
And not just in that, there's what they call the proximate target problem. And if a company stands up and says, we're doing this thing in this arena, anybody else that has an issue in any other arena might say, oh, they're willing to move, so they all of a sudden become assailed by every other group that wants their issue to gain momentum.
What I'm hearing as I hear you talk about this is there's a willingness to change. There's a receptivity. What's your take on that, Marc? Do you see a shift on the part of the students and even the business leaders that you work with?
I think the students want to do these things, but they're afraid. They're afraid because they don't know that it's possible, and they're afraid that if they raise these kinds of issues, they'll be seen as not sufficiently committed to the corporate mission. So part of what I'm trying to do in my teaching is to create space here to think about these kinds of questions in legitimately moral terms. Like, how do you articulate them? How do you talk about them? And to me, it's an essential thing, because I think part of what I want to ask y'all about is the difference between senior managers who are receptive and those who aren't receptive, and what it is that makes some senior managers more receptive. I want to make my students more open. I want to make my students willing to lead. And later we can talk about examples where I think businesses have really led in this space.
Please respond to that.
Well,
What is
over the
difference
20
that you
years,
notice?
I've seen a difference in who comes to the dialogue. When we first, 20 years ago, when we were having dialogues, you'd get the corporate secretary in the legal office because, you know, they wanted to get it off their proxy.
Or if you're really unlucky, just somebody from investor relations.
Yeah, that's true. And, you know, over the years, we get the people who are really responsible for the supply chain or for the training or that type of thing. So that's helpful. And you get women on the board. There's just a whole difference in the atmosphere of the dialogue. And I just heard today that, you know, that statue of that girl that's in front of Wall Street with the bull, that they've moved her, but in the years she's been there, 301 more companies have put at least one woman on the board of directors. So it's changing, just like, you know, the House of Representatives is changing. So those are a couple things I would say, and Bruce probably.
Well, what I often find is it's a matter of time. And so when you first bring something to the company's attention, almost universally, they view it as a threat. Anything from outside the border comes in as a threat. And you know, Procter & Gamble years ago, you know, we became good colleagues after a period of time, and he actually showed me his original letter. He said, I took this letter and I wrote on the side of it, your first letter that came in, I will assess the threat. And I gave it to my superior officer, you know, and went up. And that was their orientation.
That was the corporate secretary.
That was our relationship, Scott. And but over time, then what happens is circumstances conspire to show the efficacy of what we're talking about. And I mean, one classic example of that was Pepsi, who for years was being talked to about water use, overuse of water in India, and drying up the aquifers in the wells and the farmers' wells going dry. Company said there was no issue whatsoever. Colleagues at ICCR brought it up for several years, and it culminated in the annual meeting where the chairman again just said there's no issue whatsoever. You know, these are just gadflies, you know, special interests and so forth. Less than 2 weeks later, one of the major regions in India revoked all of Pepsi's bottling licenses because of the drying up of all the wells. So exactly. So often it's a matter of time before things. Yeah. But going back to your example of talking to the gun company, often it's and having a new person on board. Often it's a matter of having an outside voice that comes in that gives integrity to the inner person. It gives them the validity and standing to then go and say, well, you know, I'm not just saying this myself. They might feel too concerned about their position to do that. I'm not just concerned about this myself, but look, we're getting shareholders calling in or writing in. And in the shareholder voice in particular, because collectively the shareholders own the company.
Right.
And so we do have some power, albeit management has worked assiduously over the years to try and minimize the power that shareholders have, and we can talk about that too. But we do have a voice.
There is so much more that we're going to talk about on this that needs to be discussed. We've come almost to the end of our time for this first program. But what I'd like to do, and a reminder that we will tackle more of these issues in the next program, but what I might ask right now is from the perspective of your work, Bruce and Judy, people out there watching say, what can I do to support your work? What can they do?
So what can people do? People can use their money in line with their values. Is it a panacea that will be the key in each and every instance? No, but it's an important and critical starting point, and a point by which companies, you benchmark. By notifying a company with a letter or with a shareholder proposal, you have benchmarked where they are so that as time goes on, you can then calibrate whether they're moving, whether they're not, and then whether they're culpable and liable if they didn't, and then whatever you're talking about comes to pass.
Well, and consumers, because they have something the companies want, money. And just a quick example, I don't know if we have time, but a couple of years ago when it became known that of the slavery in the shrimp industry in Thailand, how the workers on the boats, et cetera, were basically slaves and treated that way. And the big companies like Kroger and Costco and Walmart, were implicated in that because they sold the shrimp from Thailand. A woman in one of the parishes here got interested in the issue, and she went to one of the local supermarkets and looked at the label and saw that the shrimp were coming from Thailand. So she called the manager. She called the company, and they said, no, that our shrimp doesn't come from there, and that's not, we're not implicated in that. And so she went back to the store and took pictures of the packages and sent it to him, and she got her pastor and her parish to say that they would no longer serve shrimp at church functions until something was done about that issue. Unfortunately, something is happening with that issue. It still has a long ways to go, but at least it's seen the light of day, so it's being addressed.
Well, we are also going to be putting up some information in terms of contacting or supporting your organization, and there are so many more points here we need to discuss, and we will. And we'll do that in the next episode of Challenge 2.0. So at this point, we thank you for joining us today. Tune in again next week for part 2 of our discussion. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.